The election of Jimmy Carter in 1976 brought in a new Democratic president who had declared that he would reveal the truth about the ET presence once in office. Carter was the first U.S. president who was on the public record as having witnessed a UFO. Carter, however, would find that as president, he would be unable to determine the full extent of U.S. clandestine programs focused on the ET presence, far less have any power to influence how to politically manage the ET presence. Even though his national security advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski, was one of the first directors of PI-40 and would have now taken over the chair of MJ-12 from Kissinger, Carter and his principal advisors found that they were simply denied the necessary information on the ET presence, making it painfully clear that executive oversight of the ET presence was non-existent. A project funded by the Carter administration in May 1977 through the Stanford Research Institute, SRI, to explore extraterrestrial communication was terminated 4 months later through Pentagon pressure. The Pentagon simply threatened the directors of the SRI that it would terminate projects the Pentagon funded for SRI if the latter went ahead with the White House Center. After the debacle over its extraterrestrial communication project, Carter and his senior advisors quickly recognized they were minor players as far as the ET presence was concerned. Indeed, this lack of ability to politically manage ET affairs may well have been a critical factor in the Iranian Revolution that did so much to undermine Carter's re-election chances. The Republican electoral campaign of 1980 brought with it a new dimension to the political management of the ET presence. Ronald Reagan came into the campaign as a crusading anti-communist with fixed views that only negotiating from a position of military strength was the means of countering the Soviet threat to global democracy. Privately, however, Reagan had a similar perspective on the ET presence and what he viewed as the need to negotiate from a position of strength vis-a-vis the ET threat to humanity. Like his predecessor, President Carter, Reagan had an encounter with UFOs. Unlike Carter, however, he developed a strong belief that the ET presence was a threat to humanity that had to be militarily contained. In contrast, his opponent in the Republican primaries, former CIA Director George Bush, brought with him a more moderate Republican ideology, an ideology that was more consistent with the views of MJ-12/PI-40, which Bush had previously been a member of, and of Henry Kissinger, who was by now the undisputed master strategist for MJ-12/PI-40 with nearly 40 years' experience in dealing with the ET presence. The election of Reagan over Bush would certainly have come as a disappointment to Kissinger and MJ-12/PI-40, not only in terms of it bringing another outsider who impacted the ability of MJ-12/PI-40 to politically manage the ET presence, but also because it allowed a dangerous element to emerge in the clandestine effort to manage this presence. MJ-12/PI-40, under Kissinger, was fully aware of the complexities of the ET presence in terms of different traces and orientations, and ensuring that interaction with the numerous clandestine organizations embedded in the different military organizations and intelligence agencies coordinated in a way that maintained a global balance of power. What Kissinger and MJ-12/PI-40 were most concerned about was the danger of clandestine organizations in the U.S. military and/or intelligence services engaging in a dangerous confrontation with ET races that could degenerate into a large-scale hostilities leading to a war of the worlds. As the master Bismarckian strategist, Kissinger was concerned to maintain the balance of power while simultaneously advancing the strategic position of the U.S. vis-à-vis ET races. PI-40, again under the leadership of Kissinger after having served his full term as head of MJ-12, was therefore intent on containing any military adventurism on the part of clandestine organizations in the U.S. military that were at best too confrontational, or at worst infiltrated by ET races intent on initiating global confrontation. What most concerned MJ-12/PI-40 was the possibility that a presidential administration could be unduly influenced by clandestine military organizations that either were prone to military adventurism and/or been infiltrated by ET races. Soon after his election, Reagan demonstrated a rigid belief of the nature of the ET threat, and laced many of his public statements referring to the AT presence and its threat to humanity. According to Dixon Davis, one of the two CIA agents appointed to brief Reagan when he was president-elect, the problem with Ronald Reagan was that all his ideas were all fixed. He thought that he knew about everything. He was an old dog. Reagan's anti-communist rhetoric and massive build-up of military forces was a cover for Reagan's true desire to militarily confront ET races. His first major public comment on an ET threat occurred at a 1985 US-Soviet summit meeting with Mikhail Gorbachev at Geneva when he said, "I couldn't help but, when you stop to think that we're all God's children, wherever we live in the world, I couldn't help but say to him, Gorbachev, just how easy his task and mine might be if suddenly there was a threat to this world from some other species from another planet outside in the universe. We'd forget all the little local differences that we have between our countries and we would find out once and for all that we really are all human beings here on this earth together. Well, I guess we can wait for some alien race to come down and threaten us, but I think that between us we can bring about that realization." If his unscheduled comments at a US-Soviet summit were not itself a provocative enough expression of Reagan's views on the possible threat of an ET presence, then his speech to the 42nd UN General Assembly of the United Nations on September 21, 1987, was even more provocative and disturbing in its implications. In our obsession with antagonisms of the moment, we often forget how much unites all the members of humanity. Perhaps we need some outside, universal threat to make us recognize this common bond. I occasionally think how quickly our differences worldwide would vanish if we were facing an alien threat from outside of this world. And yet I ask, is not an alien force already among us? For Colonel Philip Corso, and other conservative military officers, Reagan was a hero who knew how to best respond to the AT presence, a global defensive shield that could shoot down ET craft anywhere around the planet. The Strategic Defense Initiative had little to do with shooting down ballistic nuclear missiles, and really was part of a planetary shield desired by clandestine organizations in the military wanting to militarily confront the AT presence. Reagan's conservative political philosophy and public statements on the need for a massive military build-up to the Soviet threat were allusions to the perceived danger of an ET invasion. Reagan and his political advisors were considered by Kissinger, Brzezinski, and others in MJ12/PI40, a threat to the political management of the ET presence and to the tenuous peace that existed between clandestine organizations around the planet and ET races. Given the gravity of Reagan's fixed views and the implications for managing the AT presence, it is very likely groups responsive to the concerns of PI40 played a role in attempting to have Reagan removed from public office and replaced by an MJ12/PI40 member, George Bush, the vice president and former head of the CIA. The Hinckley assassination attempt in 1981 was possibly an attempt by organizations loosely linked with PI40 to either remove or intimidate Reagan so as to prevent what could have been a disastrous unraveling of the covert global cooperation in managing the AT presence. The eventual result of the assassination attempt was that the Reagan administration's militaristic impulses were sufficiently restrained so as to ensure that no military confrontation with ET races would spiral out of control. The 1988 election of George Bush once again allowed MJ12/PI40 to again dominate the strategic thinking of a presidential administration. As a former member of MJ12/PI40, Bush was all too aware of the need to politically manage the AT presence in the mold dictated by Kissinger during the Nixon administration. Indeed, Kissinger's support was critical in the appointment of Bush to become the director of the CIA in 1975, and his promotion to MJ12 from PI40, not long after the Watergate scandal had begun to subside. Public secrecy, monopolizing decision-making power in MJ12/PI40, maintaining the balance of power, and continuing to reverse ET technology for weapons acquisition, and maintaining the prominent role of corporate America in dealing with the ET presence, were the keys to politically managing the AT presence. MJ12/PI40 was certainly content with its influence under the Bush administration, and there is evidence that international events were managed in a way that would support the 1992 re-election of President Bush. The end of the Cold War was certainly a gift to the Bush administration that normally would have ensured a second election victory for an administration enjoying such a tremendous foreign policy success. The successful outcome of the Gulf War in 1991 was similarly an event that would have normally secured a successful re-election campaign. The outcome of the 1992 presidential election appeared so certain that prominent Democrats decided not to run and viewed 1996 as the best time for a presidential campaign. The election of President Clinton was certainly a surprise development for MJ12/PI40 and once again had the effect of placing an outsider in the White House. Clinton, like Carter before him, soon found out that he had minimal influence over the political management of the AT presence. Even more disturbing, his senior political officials, including the Director of Central Intelligence, James Woolsey, and Secretary of Defense, William Cohen, had little knowledge of the ET presence. Stephen Greer narrated the following exchange he had with a famous astronaut: "Recently I was in Washington meeting with a very famous astronaut. Everyone would know this person's name. This particular astronaut had during his career been in possession of a very specific incontrovertible piece of evidence related to UFOs. It is something that if disclosed would be clear and definitive." This astronaut described how he had approached and worked directly with President Clinton's Secretary of Defense William Cohen to look into and retrieve from classified projects this specific piece of evidence, of that which he had all the specific details. The words used by this astronaut to me were, "There was an inordinate large amount of money and personal time by the Secretary of Defense William Cohen was spent to locate this evidence, and he was never given access to it." This suggested that many of those sitting in MJ12/PI40 were hangovers from the Bush administration, and Clinton's political appointments were not trusted to maintain secrecy. Clinton's efforts to extract information from clandestine organizations proved fruitless, as evidenced in the following quote from William Lapel, who worked with the CIA in the early days of the Clinton administration. "It was known among the high CIA people, and the people who had contact with these people, that the Clintons were on the prowl for UFOs. Bill Clinton had been asking anyone who would listen to him, to tell him the secret. He would get some admiral in there, and say, by the way, tell me the UFO secret. They would just look at him like, what planet are you from?" Clinton's interest and efforts to gain information on the ET presence and clandestine projects were a threat to MJ12/PI40 insofar as Clinton's initiatives threatened the veil of secrecy that had been existing since the 1940s. More importantly, Clinton's efforts may well have been viewed as the initial stages of an attempt to re-establish executive oversight. It is not too difficult to surmise that many of Clinton's political problems were a result of clandestine efforts to distract the Clinton administration, and ensure minimal support for his domestic policies. Clinton became resigned to serving his term with only minimal knowledge of the ET presence, and without having any serious impact on how to politically manage the AT presence. His remarks to a question from a Northern Ireland teenager in November 1995 testify to his political impotence on the AT presence. "I got a letter from 13-year-old Ryan from Belfast. Now, Ryan, if you're out in the crowd tonight, here's the answer to your question. No, as far as I know, an alien spacecraft did not crash in Roswell, New Mexico, in 1947. And, Ryan, if the United States Air Force did recover alien bodies, they didn't tell me about it, either, and I want to know." The election of George W. Bush in 2000 once again led to an insider, or at least an insider's loyal son, to be in the White House. George Bush, Sr., would henceforth play a key role in steering his son, who lacked the kind of intellectual qualities to be a member of PI40 or Council on Foreign Affairs, in his own right, but served as a useful figurehead that could gain the loyalty of the American public in ways that the more urbane and sophisticated George Bush Sr., and Nelson Rockefeller before him, never could.